So we have invited a wide range of law professionals to answer any of your questions, and Lauren and I will be facilitating the panel, which will start with the 30 minutes of facilitated discussion and then followed by 45 minutes of open Q&A.
If you have any questions, please write them down or keep track of them before putting them in the chat during the open Q&A. Amy and I will try our best to facilitate the question to the most suitable panelists. So let's start with an introduction from our panelists in alphabetical order, starting with Mr. Goodman.
Oh, hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name's Adam Goodman. I guess I graduated from Osgood at York University in 2007. Jumped out on my own practicing criminal law, did a lot of different things in that space. I've done some other things with respect to legal education. I'm doing some administrative tribunal work. Over the years, I've been to the Human Rights Tribunal and maybe one or two others, but I'm doing a lot of university type student work as well. So that's become very prevalent during COVID. So I don't know, I guess I just do a lot of different things, and I never really fell in with the law firm or any of the traditional means of practice that you're going to hear about a little bit later. Not like there's anything wrong with them, but it just wasn't my thing.
All right, thank you. What about Mr. Wei?
Hi, everyone. My name's Lucian. I would have to be the most recent law graduate here. So I did my undergrad at the University of Toronto. I'm from Toronto originally, and then I headed to New York, where I studied at NYU for law school, which I just completed 2 months ago. And I'm in the middle of bar prep right now. But starting this September, I'll be working for Vincent & Elkins, which is one of the New York sort of the big law firms, and practicing mostly in the corporate space, most likely in bankruptcy or something to do with sort of energy transactions. Aside from that, because during law school and throughout undergrad too, actually, I taught LSAT for a while. Probably most of my work has been related to LSAT. And yeah, so I'm happy to be here and happy to see you all.
Professor Bala?
Hi, I'm Nick Bala, and I teach at the Faculty of Law at Queen's University. I attended University of Toronto many years ago, Queen's Law School, and later Harvard Law School for a graduate degree. I teach family law and do most of my research and policy work in the family law area. I also teach contracts, which is a first-year subject.
Thank you, and Mr. Rajaya?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I graduated IB, I think in 2012. And then because I'm Singaporean, I did military service. And 2 years later, I went to King's College London. I did my law there as an undergrad, and then they have this double degree program with Columbia Law School in New York. So I graduated from both King's and Columbia in 2019. I then started working at Sherman & Sterling in New York. And then I relocated back to Singapore because that's where I'm originally from. I do mostly, anti-corruption work, sanctions work, basically advising US companies and other multinationals that operate in Asia. So yeah, that's just a brief background.
All right. So I think that's all the introductions, and we can go on to our facilitated discussion, which we have a few questions prepared just to get a better idea of your experiences and I guess how that differs and how, and maybe this time attendees, you guys can take down your questions and leave them for the Q&A at the end. So because everyone here has such a differing experiences in law, I guess we can start off with a question like, when did you decide that law was for you, and what experiences sparked your interest in law?
Are we continuing with the order you?
Yeah, we can go with the same.
Oh, yeah.
All right. You know what? I was one of those kids that wanted to be a lawyer when I was probably 8 years old, but I didn't really know what that meant. It just was something that I just decided I wanted to do, probably because I felt I could argue and debate. Come law school, it was not at all really what I expected. And it was a lot of people that were there that probably weren't the same as me, that may have fell into it for different, completely valid reasons. So I mean, that was kind of my early experience. I didn't love law school. Looking back at it now, I think I probably would like it a lot more if I started it again as an adult, because I now appreciate some of the intricacies and some of the usefulness of some of the concepts. What was the question again?
So the question was, I guess, what sparked your interest in law, and when did you decide that law was for you?
Okay, yeah. So I guess I think I answered it. In high school, I did DECA, I did a lot of mock trials and things like that. I mean, nobody was surprised. I think my grad quote was "Law school, here I come." But again, I didn't know what it meant. So I really have since figured it out. I think there's probably people I went to law school with that probably still haven't figured it out. And that's what's cool about it too, because you don't need to become a practicing lawyer. There's so many different and amazing things that you can do. And education's never a bad thing, even if you don't end up having anything to do with the practice of law.
So to jump in, because if we're still following the order there, I was very similar there, where I was interested in law from a fairly young age. Actually, I think the thing that cemented my interest was that in high school, as part of my school's co-op program, I worked with a criminal defense lawyer for a semester, and then she hired me afterwards as a legal assistant. So that was a very exciting experience, because when I was working as a legal assistant, and I was in 12th grade at the time, and I continued working with her throughout undergrad. And so I knew I wanted to pursue law, but not specifically what area. Just I think a lot of kids who are interested in law have a similar experience to Adam and myself, where it's you're good at debating, or you're good at arguing in some ways, and you have an interest in law without knowing exactly what that might look like. I also really appreciated that because of the way law works in Canada and in the US, you don't study as your undergrad. You can study whatever you want as your undergrad. So I felt really free to pursue whatever I was interested in without having to worry about is this going to contribute to my ultimate legal practice? I could just grow plants in the basement of U of T and just have that experience. And it teaches you things like time management and project management, maybe, but it doesn't have to be directly relevant. I could just say, well, this looks cool, let me go do it. So it was very flexible as far as my undergrad was concerned.
Yeah, if I can just expand on those two comments, particularly to people who are ending their high school careers or starting their university careers. One of the really good things about legal education, or thinking about going to law school, is that, as Lucian said, you don't have to have any particular academic background. In fact, to the contrary, there are people who study theology, there are people who study music, biology. It is certainly true that there are probably more law students who do history, politics, philosophy, English than some other areas, but you really, in terms of preparation for law school, the requirements in North America, it's any kind of post-secondary education that's a university level would be appropriate to get in. And you don't have to decide, particularly when I look at Lauren and Amy, I say, oh, you're just starting university, future lawyers, you might be future lawyers, you might be future microbiologists, you might be future musicians. You don't have to decide now. Although there are people like Adam and Lucian who sort of know when they're in high school, I want to be a lawyer. Whether they've been debaters or seen it on TV or had experience in social justice, that's all great. But many people don't decide until third or fourth year university. They enjoy studies, they're doing well, but they wonder do they, and of course some people will work for a couple of years before coming to law school, whether in a legally related area or doing anything else, working at a restaurant or working in business, and then they can come to law school. And most people who come to law school don't have a good idea of what they want to do. One of the things I'm do as a professor and I'm doing this summer is meeting with first-year law students, people who graduate from first year, complete first year, and are now choosing their courses for second year and saying, well, now do I have to decide? And to some extent, the further along you go, the more you're likely to be making decisions that are going to affect your future. On the other hand, one of the good things about a legal education is that there's a lot of possibilities. And I think you're hearing about this from the panel. There are people who graduate from law school who don't practice law, who go into politics or government. And for some people, getting a legal education is probably more valuable to them than, let's say, getting a PhD in philosophy. They've been studying philosophy, so I sort of enjoy this, but the reality is, if I get a PhD in philosophy, there are not many jobs for philosophers. It's very interesting, but it's a very small field. Whereas if I go to law school, there are a huge range of things I can end up doing, including the things we talked about in this panel. So it's a very general kind of post graduate education, in the sense that you already have a BA or a BSc, and you're developing your intellectual skills, your analytical skills, your writing skills, your communication skills, as well as developing a knowledge of the law and legal analysis, and developing things, as we mentioned, argumentation and so on. So that's something to be thinking about. Oh, and then the question of when did I decide to go to law school? Or, well, when in fact, I decided sort of towards the end of my university career. I was getting a BA in economics, and I almost went to business school, but I decided to go to law school. I don't regret that at all. I practiced for a few years and ended up going to graduate school and teaching, which has been a great career for me. But I certainly could have been happily practicing law, I think, and stayed with that also.
Yeah. So I guess for me, my path was a bit different, because I started studying laws in undergrad, just because I think in Singapore and some Commonwealth jurisdictions, and plus the UK, of course, you start studying laws in undergrad. So for me, I sort of had to make that decision a bit earlier. It was made easier by the fact that because of my upbringing, my parents basically narrowed it down to either medicine or the law. And my dad's a lawyer, so I grew up always listening to his stories about, the criminal cases he's doing in criminal defense, or the matrimonial proceedings that he was helping clients with. So I always grew up sort of listening to what was going on and being quite tuned in with the law. So I think that made the decision a bit easier for me. And I think Prof. Bala actually brings up a very good point, which is that even if you do decide to go to law school, what I thought I'd be doing at the start, like when I was in my first year of law school, I thought, I'm going to be doing litigation. I'm going to come back to Singapore and practice in the criminal defense bar. I'm going to be doing matrimonial proceedings. And it turns out that's not what I ended up doing. So really, the world is your oyster. And I think the law opens up a ton of paths for you to pursue. Even if you decide to stay within the law, or if you decide to go out of the law, I think it's a very versatile sort of education and degree that you can really maximize. So yeah.
Thank you guys for all sharing your experiences and how you guys decided to go into law. What about, how do you stumble upon the field that you're in, or you're currently in? And how do you decide that field was for you?
Well, good question. You know what? I wasn't that happy in law school, looking back at it. And I sort of had no idea what I wanted to do. I didn't make the cut for all the big jobs that everybody desperately wanted back then. Many people aren't even still practicing in those firms that gave them those jobs. And I sort of fell into a criminal defense job. And I did it, and I wasn't thrilled with it during the articling year, but I sort of decided to try and make a go of it, and I did. And I was always interested in, it was never only what I wanted to do. There are certainly some amazing criminal lawyers who they love it, and they're just constantly reading cases, and they just know everything about it, and they're fantastic. That just wasn't me. So that's why I started looking into other projects and other business opportunities that, you know, I'm not a good example when they tell you to pick one thing and do it really well and find your niche, because I just have so many different things going on, but, you know, I've enjoyed it.
For me, I've always, like, my undergrad interests, I spent almost all of my time in the lab working with guppies, working with plants and stuff like that. And I still enjoy gardening now, but it wasn't my interest in, it didn't overlap at all with my interest in law. You know, even in undergrad, my interest in law was to do with economics and finance and that kind of thing. That wasn't my area of study, but it was just what I was interested in. And so I knew early on that I wanted to try and sort of make a go of it in the financial law sphere, so corporate law. Hence why I decided to head to the States. I think basically all my classmates, and I think a lot of Canadians who head to the States have to make that decision a little earlier just because of the financial considerations. If you're going to be spending a lot more on law school, you're probably thinking, okay, I'll make a go of it at Manhattan salaries. In terms of my specific practice area, I liked bankruptcy a lot. I wasn't super committed to it, and that's like a real thing where, you know, throughout undergrad, you're kind of like, okay, I'll figure out what kind of law I want to do in law school. And then like first year, you're thinking, okay, maybe I'll figure it out in second year, but you never actually, you just kind of like fall into it. Some people, they go in knowing I definitely want to do this area, but like Professor Bala said, it's a versatile enough degree that you can really, whatever piques your fancy, right? Like, and so with bankruptcy, I did a little bit over the summer. I took courses on it, and I liked that practice area a lot. I think just because of its nature, where it's kind of like a project or something's gone not according to plan, and it's kind of the not necessarily the end for the company, but just it's more about, okay, what are we going to do now? And I think I like that aspect of it. And there's other intellectual considerations, which I think adds to its whatever area of law you want to pursue. You want to pursue what you enjoy. You don't have to stick to one particular thing, and you don't have to decide early on. But if there's an area of law where you start reading it and you're like, wow, this all sort of clicks and it's really interesting to go through, I think that's a good way to make your decision.
So I would just reflect a little bit on what was some of the previous speakers. So Adam's experience, by the way, is not uncommon. He said, oh, I didn't really like law school. It so happens I love law school. That's probably why I'm still in one as a prof. I think many people really enjoy law school, and frankly, there are some differences in terms of the quality or the nature of the experience. I teach at a smaller or mid-sized Canadian law firm, which I think has a fairly warm and supportive environment. So most of our students enjoy it. But certainly there's some who are pretty unhappy and nevertheless become very happy lawyers. So law school, I think, is for many an intellectually and socially interesting experience, but it's actually quite different from the practice of law for many. One of the issues that's just been touched on here is for some of you think, oh, if you want to practice law in the United States, you have to go to law school in the United States, and it's certainly it's not a bad thing. And I think Lucian, you want to be in New York, and New York is probably the commercial capital of the world, or one of the commercial capitals, along with certainly Singapore, London, and so on. But going to a place like NYU is great, but there certainly are Canadians who have, I've had students come from Queens and after 3 years in law school in Ontario who've written and passed the New York bar. It's a more challenging route to get to New York, but it doesn't, if you go to a Canadian law school, doesn't mean you can't practice law in the United States. And in fact, ironically, it's the other way around. If you go to, for a variety of fairly arcane reasons, if you go to an American law school, you may not be able to write the Canadian bar. So it's actually easier to go from Canada to the United States. And I think a point that was made by a number of people, and you've actually heard from Rishi a little bit, is when you're in law, if you've been called to the bar, people do move around. Like, it's not like you've made a decision and this is what it is you're going to end up doing. And in that sense, in the counseling that I do with students or see how their lives progress, I think taking different courses in law school may help you decide to some extent. Certainly what we can call experiential learning, or whether it's a summer job in one area. Lucian mentioned, oh, he spent some time working for a criminal lawyer. That was probably a great experience. It doesn't sound like he's ending up practicing criminal law. So that and there's nothing wrong with taking experience. You know what? This was really exciting, but I don't want to do it. That's how you learn, in part. Hopefully, you'll in some cases you may rely on your background. If you've been working in the doing, for example, economics, business, you say, oh, I think I want to do business law, securities work, mergers and acquisitions. That's great. But there are people who, as one of my classmates studied music, and he ended up a judge on the Supreme Court of Canada. That was Tom Cromwell. So, and he's now retired. Well, retired from the Supreme Court. He's happily practicing law in Vancouver and so on. And I think so. There is flexibility. You don't have to feel you're making a decision, or particularly you don't have to feel you're making an irrevocable decision. And I think people. One of the things I tell students is it's easier to see the path back than the path ahead. So if you're just graduating from high school and you're saying, well, I wonder what kind of law I want to practice, you don't have to decide now. And in fact, although it may be useful for you, you may watch some movies or talk to some people, or work somewhere, get some experience, but it's something that you will develop over time. And there's not necessarily just one thing out there that you're not finding your career. You're working through your life and seeing what you enjoy, seeing what you're good at, seeing what you find rewarding, seeing what kind of social contributions you can make in different areas. And for some people, they will go to one place and they will work in that their entire career. But many people will move around to a greater or lesser extent. I think I actually heard that from the two people who've been called to the bar. Both Adam and Rishi have already moved around a little bit in what they're doing, and I would say, compared to me, they're relatively young. So don't feel you're making. One of the things I tell students, and I'll just end with this, is you're making one decision at a time. So I think, one of the problems that students have, I'm advising students who are starting second year, you have a range of every law school, you can take a range of different courses, and there are people who think, well, I'm deciding right now, do I want to practice mergers and acquisitions law in downtown New York, or am I going to practice, criminal law in Toronto? What do I do? You're not making that decision. You have, and in fact, going into second year, you can take a range of courses and see what you enjoy and what you're good at, and make one decision at a time.
So I think the one, silver lining from the pandemic and, everything that's been going around the world is that the world's become a much smaller place. Like all of us, I'm in Singapore, you guys in Canada, Lucian is in New York, like everyone is just on a call. Things, can still go on very smoothly. And so in that sense, open mind about like what you want to do. Even in law school, just go for as many courses as you can. Experiential classes are great because that gives you a bit of a taste of what the practice of law might be like. And, I think what has been quite instructive for me is that you tend to know what you don't want very quickly rather than what you want. And I think that's very good, like for you to rule out certain things and then you're sort of narrowing your decisions, right? So for myself, I think, when I first started in law school in London, I thought I was going to do criminal defense litigation, family law, come back to Singapore. Then I was like, contract and commercial law is really interesting. It's very like intellectually stimulating. And I love the commercial aspect and trying to weave different things together to make it very palatable for a commercial client. And then I started practicing in New York. And because I speak Mandarin, I grew up studying Mandarin as a second language for like 12 years. I started to work with a particular partner that does a lot of work for clients in mainland China, Greater China, and the rest of Asia. And because of my background, coming from Singapore and speaking Mandarin, that proved to be very useful. And I sort of quickly built myself a niche. Now, doing that at a very early stage in your career has like pros and cons. But I've definitely enjoyed it so far. I think the kind of experience you get interacting with clients that operate in this part of the world, but want to understand like US laws and how they apply to them. And being that bridge to me is something I really enjoy. Trying to fit in the law into different cultural nuances and different jurisdictions and operations and environments. I think that's super fascinating. So when you start a law school, and if you go to law school, just try out different things. Even in your undergrad, try out different things. You quickly realize what you like and what you don't like, and then just take it as it goes. I think it's always good to have sort of a very broad plan about what you want to do with your life. But in terms of the smaller, minute details you want to fix on, just sort of go with the flow, and I guess you'll figure it out. Yeah.
All right. I think those were really great answers. We have some time for one more question that's facilitated, but right now, if attendees have any questions, you can send it to me or Lauren privately, just so that it doesn't get lost into the chat. And on the note of like the pandemic and how the world is slowly evolving right now, I guess we can talk about how, what do you think will be changing in the future of law in your area of expertise? Maybe, I guess in light of the pandemic, or also with technology that's evolving. Mr. Goodman, do you want to take this one?
Well,
or for now, yeah.
Don't lose the benefits from a good pandemic. Because a lot of really neat stuff has happened. I'm going to go through the bad first, and then I'll explain, and I'll move quickly. But the ability to represent a client in a courtroom and run a trial in the courtroom, you can't replicate that online. We've tried, and we've done well with a lot of it. But in order to actually do a trial and look at a witness, I don't necessarily think I'm prepared to give that up in person and address a judge in person and advocate in person. However, out of a lot of the Zoom things that I've done, once you get into it, it's actually pretty good. And you're able to look, like you can see people's faces. Like last week, I wanted to know what a judge was thinking. I pinned her on my screen to see how she reacted to certain things, and she had no way of knowing that. But a lot of the good is also—
She will now.
She doesn't know who it was. I guess she can figure it out. But the problem with criminal law is we were driving around the province for little court appearances. And now I can just click a button and I can be in court in Kingston, in court in Toronto, and in court in all the different courthouses in Toronto. So I might be able to do 3 things in a day, where it used to be one of those might be my day. And we're able to serve clients better in that sense, but we still have a long way to go. The dealing with criminal clients at the jails and access to them during the pandemic, it has been absolutely horrid. And client service has been hurt from things like that. But if we can address those issues, I do think a lot of good can come of it. And the ability to do a consultation with the client by logging into my computer, where it used to be I'd run down to the office, I'd try to get there before they got there. Sometimes they wouldn't show up and I'd be frustrated, and it just turned into a whole production, where now turn on your computer and those conversations, I find they're just as good over Zoom than they were in person.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know how much I have to add to this. I might have to punt on this one to the 3 people who are, more actively engaged in sort of the legal field. I will just say, especially at your current stages, most people here are in high school. There are lots of, I think Adam said, don't waste don't waste the benefits of a good pandemic. There are lots of sort of opportunities that can come up now too. Just with sort of things the way they are, not necessarily, I don't mean you have to go out and do something big. I mean that you have time to pursue other interests, other hobbies, to sort of think about that. And I'm going to largely punt on this so that we can hear more from the 3 panelists, because I think they would have more to offer on this. Professor Bala?
So one aspect of the pandemic, and I think Adam had, a very good point, that there have been advantages and disadvantages, and if you want, even winners and losers. I think in terms of law schools, one of the things is that certainly most Canadian law schools, all Canadian law schools are planning to resume classes in person. We had a year on Zoom. That was good that if for some students and that they could continue to live at home, which may have been less expensive. But I think for me, the heart of, we haven't talked too much about legal education, meeting face to face, not only with the professor, but with your classmates and learning from your classmates and informally going to coffee with people and so on. Various extracurricular activities really depend on a significant amount of in-person contact. That being said, technology has had a huge impact on the practice of law, on legal education. Unfortunately, I can still remember going to law school and thinking, oh, this is great. We have photocopiers, and we've had enormous change. And there's no doubt that the pandemic, speaking to the issue that Adam raised about the practice of law, let's say now the practice of family law in Ontario, but one could say internationally, has been dramatically impacted. One of the things I think is we've been talking about law, and there's a tendency sometimes to focus on law in the courtroom and to imagine, that's what lawyers do, they go to court. And certainly some lawyers like Mr. Goodman go to court a fair bit. Other lawyers spend their entire career. In fact, most lawyers do what we sometimes call solicitor's work or office work or paperwork or transactional work. They certainly work with clients and they're practicing law, but they're not going to court. So that's an important thing. Now, speaking about the court process for a variety of reasons, certainly in North America, Canada, Ontario, the court systems have been slow to change in general about everything. Whereas the transactional side, the private practice, doing real estate deals, computerized many years ago. So courts were requiring, as Mr. Goodman said, you'd have to go to court for, and sometimes for very small administrative matters. So, you'd be, as he said, you have one client who has to be in court in Oakville, outside Toronto, and then you have another client who has to be in court the same day in Oshawa, the other side of Toronto. Well, that's a 3-hour drive, and when travel, when traffic is bad. So how do you do that now? You can be in Zoom court in one day, 1 hour, and the next hour in a completely different place. So that's made a huge change. I should say that the pandemic has certainly helped certain kinds of clients, certain kinds of lawyers. So if you have a certain kind of practice, it's been the fact that it's on Zoom that you can file documents in court. It used to be, until recently, every single case you had to file, especially on the civil, but the family side, every single document, somebody had to go to the court and wait in line and hand it into a clerk and so on. And some, if you're a big law firm, they'd have a clerk do that. But many young lawyers were going to court for each day. They'd spend an hour driving to the court, filing the documents, waiting. Now everything's online. It's like a revolution, huge. And their clients often are happier. People who are going through, we haven't talked about this, especially in family law. There are people who find it stressful to go to speak to their lawyer, stressful to go to court. Now they can sit in their study and feel relatively comfortable, talk to the lawyer, they don't have to drive downtown, and then they'll be in court, they'll feel more comfortable in their own their study or their living room than they will be in a courtroom. That being said, there are many people who suffered enormously. People, it's great to say, oh, everybody has computer access. No, they don't. There are people, particularly in Ontario, legal aid clients, some of Adam's clients, if you're in prison, you kind of like seeing your lawyer. And now, you may get a Zoom call, you may not. And again, going to criminal court, I think some clients in some contexts want to be there in court. And certainly, I think the challenge in the family justice system and the criminal justice system certainly in North America going ahead is which parts of the Zoom court are we going to keep and which parts are we going to require people to come back to court, either require or allow them to come back to court. And court, meaning both, the courts presided over by judges, Mr. Goodman does, for example, he mentioned he has some academic work, academic dishonesty matters, which may be before a university tribunal. People like myself, professors, might be sitting there. Maybe some of those hearings will continue to be all on Zoom. Some things will be partly on Zoom, partly not, the hybrid model. That's something that we're certainly both practicing lawyers, the bar, professors like myself are studying those questions, trying to decide how we'll move into the post-pandemic environment. But you'll undoubtedly see enormous changes, and certainly one of the points that's been made about international practice is already a lot easier. I should say one of the things that Rishi mentioned that is really important is having a second language, or second or third language, is often very, very helpful in law. I mean, one of the things that one could interpret what he said, well, the most important thing I did for my practice was I learned Mandarin. That's great. That's a huge advantage. And some of you may already speak Mandarin or Cantonese or Arabic or Russian or something. There are a lot of languages and skills that you can have that may affect your practice. You may not realize how, but they may well do that.
Yeah, I think historically, and this is obviously an overgeneralization, but lawyers have never been the best to adapt to what the rest of the world is doing. It can be technology, it can be, on the latest trends, even getting me to move to using iManage on our computer and our firm system was like a nightmare. So I think this pandemic has sort of forced change upon us. So in my view, I think lawyers have learned to, you either adapt or you get lost in the flow. And in that sense, even for practice, it's really changed a ton for me. So a lot of my work is doing internal investigations for multinationals and corporate clients. And in the past, before, I guess, 2020, the start of 2020, all these investigations would take place in person, right? Like you're doing witness interviews, they have to be in person. You have to pick up on the small nuances the witness is giving to you, assess the credibility. And a lot of that depends on how you read the witness in person. And like Adam mentioned, everything has completely changed, like how you read the judge, how you read the witness, how do you, pick up on small things. I think they've become more important than ever, but you have to do it differently. Now you're doing it virtually. And so being able to adapt to that is pretty important. I think clients do expect lawyers to adapt to that, right? If their businesses are adapting to doing things completely virtually, lawyers should be no exception as well. So I think work has changed a lot in terms of practice. But I also want to address professional well-being and life as a lawyer. I think the pandemic has brought, pros and cons as with everything. The good part is that, work from home, there's flexibility, right? You have a bit more control over your schedule to some degree, but also to some degree, people expect you to be always connected, right? Sometimes there's this misconception that, you're at home anyway, what else could you be doing? And I hope, that doesn't come, I hope none of you experience that. And I've not really experienced that, but, some of my friends who are working in law firms do, get emails and messages over the weekend with the implicit or explicit expectation that they are to reply that immediately because, you're on lockdown, you can't be doing anything else except work, right? So I think having a better grip on, boundaries to the extent that you can, and like your mental well-being is pretty important. Like knowing when to carve out time for yourself, to go to the gym or, to read a book or, just spend time with family every day. And having that discipline is pretty important. I think a lot of lawyers are can be very type A and be like, yeah, I want to do this, especially when you're young and you're super gung-ho and you're like, yeah, I want to do this to the best of my ability. I want to show that I can do my best and like nail this assignment that's been given to me. But you also need to practice law in a sustainable way, I think. Like if you do intend to be in this practice for the long run, I think having a very sustainable approach is important, keeping in mind that, you can go all out 110% for like 2 or 3 years, but then, a lot of the young lawyers actually leave practice because they're just burnt out. And I think the pandemic sort of has brought that to light as well, where people sort of rethink their priorities and be like, yeah, maybe I do need to take a break once in a while and just, check on myself and have some me time. So yeah, I think practice has changed, but also the focus people's focus on like their own well-being and their own professional development has also changed as well.
So following up on the topic of the advancements of technology and AI, and I guess the legal industry and how it's kind of slow to change, do you think this will change?
Is that specific to any one of us, or?
Oh, sorry. I guess anyone can take it. I guess you can start.
Okay, sure. I can start. I think I can't speak for AI specifically, but I know, in law firms, document review is like the bread and butter of every lawyer in transactional work, and in litigation practice. Knowing your documents is the key to success, or whatever success you might have. So I think in that sense, a lot of stuff has moved to sort of e-discovery and smart technology in terms of detecting, if I can search some certain key terms, and some software and technology that firms now use are able to catch on that more quickly. I know there are other types of developmental technology where they're trying to do some predictive analysis on how a judge will rule on a certain case, and that might determine how you craft your submissions. I'm not super exposed to that, but definitely I think lawyers are trying to find ways to make their life easier, and if technology can do that, they will turn to it, but I think it will take a bit more time.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I think there were some really important points there. I mean, one is sort of implicit in one of your comments, or it might be the concern. Well, technology is just going to take over, and we won't need actually lawyers. For that matter, we might not need surgeons. Robots can perform surgery or whatever. I think that the history of the practice of law, of legal education, has shown that technology has had a huge impact, but there's actually continuing, and indeed many would argue a growing need for lawyers in the world, or in advanced societies, maybe in all societies. And certainly, when Canada was founded in 1867, people who were articling students would spend half their year hand copying the letters that their principals wrote. They didn't have typewriters, okay? And then people would said, my goodness, what are you going to do with all those articling students if there's someone invents a machine that can write, or let alone photocopiers, or now, Rishi mentioned document review. When I went to law school, they were hiring people. There'd be a big case, and they involving something like IBM, and they said, we're having what they call, he mentioned boxcar discovery. You're suing IBM, and IBM sends you literally a boxcar full of a rail boxcar full of documents, and some young associates will start to read through those documents one at a time and decide which ones are relevant. Now, a computer does a lot of that in and of itself, and then AI will probably help even further. So there's no doubt that AI is and will have a impact on the practice of law. But I think that the human element, human judgment, human skills will continue to be very important. It will, and certainly, Rishi and Adam pointed out that, and Lucian also, that technology is certainly affecting the way that people practice, and lawyers have to be adaptable, and some lawyers are more adaptable than others, and it also depends on the kind of practice you have. I think if you're in a big, big corporate law firm that has sophisticated clients, there's going to be expectation of the clients. If you have what some people might call a smaller retail practice, you're a sole practitioner, there may be more flexibility. But even there, again, when I graduated from law school, people couldn't imagine practicing law without what we then called a secretary. Who's going to answer the phone? Who's going to type my letters? And now it's, there are many people who would have small practices who don't need an admin assistant. I mean, it's all done by machine, and a lot more effectively and a lot cheaper. So I think that there will continue to be both opportunities, and certainly there will be effects from AI. But I think, some aspects, it turns out that it's going to be easier to have um, driverless cars than it's going to be to have AI handling your family law case.
Okay, I guess staying on the topic of the pandemic and virtual courtrooms and handling all of these, all of the work on the internet. Somebody asked, will lawyers still use Zoom after COVID-19, or would they go back in person to in-person courtrooms and in-person discussions with their clients?
Well, yeah, I mean, I addressed that earlier. I think I think we'll continue using Zoom in a lot of ways. Hopefully somebody comes up with a new courtroom type software that, I mean, Zoom wasn't created for a pandemic. So Zoom has, and I actually used Zoom before the pandemic. I was one of my claims to fame, but like I said, I think in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. The one advantage is you're going to hear a lot in your law study about access to justice. And I'm able to charge clients considerably less than I used to be able to, because I mean, Professor Bala mentioned academic hearings. If I needed to head to York to represent a student at a meeting, that might take half my day. Now I can schedule it in for 45 minutes. And I'm trying to pass along those savings. I'm not saying all my colleagues are, but you know, that could be a space for a junior counsel to zoom in and not undercut people, but to start sort of finding new ways to offer services at better type prices.
Yeah, I think Adam makes a really good point. There's no doubt that Zoom, and who knows what the next iteration of this is. I mean, it's Zoom is good. It could be probably in some ways, you know, everyone can imagine how to enhance it. Adam made a nice point, by the way, about litigation, and you know, it's sometimes helpful to, you can see a whole range of people on your screen in a way that if you're in a courtroom, you can't, because you're sort of looking at one person, or they see you looking at them. Actually, you can on Zoom, you can decide, who do I want to look at, and they may or may not be aware of it, that you're looking at them. And by the way, some people find that very disconcerting. And in fact, you know, the other side, or another side of Zoom, and frankly, we see it here as I do as a university professor. A lot of people don't like their cameras on. A lot of people don't like the camera in their home. If you're dealing with a family violence case and you've had trouble with your former spouse, do you want that person sitting there seeing your living room or your study? So there are going to be advantages and disadvantages, and the question is, how much are we going to use it? And again, universities, my law school, I say, and I think most universities in Canada are going to shift back to a lot more in person. But for example, I teach at Queen's in Kingston. If I want to have Adam come and give a guest lecture in my class, I'd say, well, Adam, you know, can you get on the train? We'll pay your train fare, and you can come, you know, you can spend a whole day coming to Kingston and speaking to class. Now, and then I have to decide, I have an hour and a half class. If I'm bringing him this far, I really want, you know, I don't want to be rude to him, so I better let him speak for, you know, an hour and a half. But now I can say, look, Adam, I only need you for 15 minutes. Would you speak to my class, and they can interact with you? Yeah, sure, 15 minutes, I'll be happy to do that. So I think we're going to see more of Zoom, or, you know, seminars where we'll have students, and we've had this already, you know, some of the students will be in Singapore, some of them will be in New York, some of them will be in Vancouver, some of them will be in Kingston. So we are going to use Zoom technology, Zoom-like technology. And the question is, what's the balance going to be?
And the screen share is great, to be able to show a judge or maybe a jury one day a quote from a case or a document, just being able to pull it up in your computer. So it used to be in court, you'd need to make sure you had the right machine and the machine had to work. And if it didn't, you'd have to call in somebody to fix it. And I'm not kidding. This is what courtrooms were like. So there's been some benefits there as well.
I guess we can go on to the next question. Again, anyone can answer this again. So one of our participants asked, how much time do you spend in court versus, you know, behind a computer doing research, or just behind a computer in general? I guess pandemic and non-pandemic times as well.
I think I'm probably the best person to answer that because I'm in court a lot. But there really is no answer. It depends what area you practice in. I have colleagues I went to law school with that have maybe never stepped inside a courtroom. I have people, and even if you're a litigator doing civil litigation, you might go years without doing a trial, whereby most criminal lawyers are on court all the time. So there's just really not a good answer to that question because it depends what you practice.
I was going to mention as well that even with areas of law where you might need to go into court, so bankruptcy is an area that where the court is supervising the bankruptcy, but the overwhelming majority of lawyers on that case will not be the ones. If they're attending court, it's because they're observing it. It's not because they're participating in it. Court is very much overrepresented in media as far as like legal practice is concerned.
By the way, implicit in what Lucian's been talking about to some extent is what's sometimes called the difference between big law and retail law. So there are in everywhere, including Canada and Toronto, Ottawa, there are large law firms that have many lawyers, associates, and would have mainly commercial government clients. And then there are people like Adam, who, and criminal law, family law, human rights law, where you have, you may be, and it sounds like Adam is on his own, but there might be criminal lawyers who have 2 or 3 people or 5 people in a law firm, and they practice law together, and they share clients, and they can, cover for one another. They go on vacation or whatever, but they're very client retail focused, if you want, on individual clients. So that's one point of distinction between different kinds of practice, and that certainly relates in part to the issue of technology. I should say, was that pandemic, there are many lawyers who spent, in fact, the vast majority of lawyers spent all their time on their computers. Was point out them. And it's actually interesting having Rishi here from Singapore. He said, well, if you don't want to be, and I, by the way, I took Rishi's point really well, and I think it's extremely important about having work-life balance. He said, well, it's important you've been sitting on your computer, go to the gym. Well, he's in Singapore, you can go to the gym. If you've been in Toronto, you can't go to the gym. We couldn't go to the gyms for a long time in Ontario. So, I mean, we've been affected even more sort of sitting in front of our computers. But I think as we move out of the pandemic, how much time people are going to spend, one of the issues is going to be how much time are people going to spend on their computer at their home, and how much are they going to spend at their office? And so that's, and like a lot of things, the answer is it's going to depend. We're going to see, it's going to evolve, depends who your employer is. Certainly, I think if you're in a sole practice or a retail practice like Adam's, you're likely to say, well, why, in fact, why have an office? I suspect, those big law firms in New York where Lucian is going to be working are less likely to say, well, we're just shutting down the office and we're going to do this all on Zoom. But we're gonna see about that. But certainly, I think even in the pandemic, some courts actually remained open in Ontario. So there, and especially in Adam's area of criminal law, there was a jury trial. So if you're going to have a jury trial, we really haven't. Although there are places in the world where they tried it, we're probably not going to have jury trials on Zoom. We are using technology in the courts, and I think again, Adam made a great point about, and so obvious about screen share. I mean, 2 years ago, that would have been like a miracle. How could we possibly share documents in a courtroom with other lawyers or with the judge? And now it's like that's just the way it's going to be. And we'll undoubtedly see some aspect of technology being used in the courtroom, and I should say in the university, in the classroom. So I know that although I'm hoping to go back to in-person teaching, and I use like others, PowerPoint and so on, oh, maybe there's things we're going to screen share, and we're going to use chat and other functions that we haven't been using in university classrooms.
I think we can move on to a few more specific questions. So there have been a few questions in the chat, and I'll try to combine them together. But this one is directed at Mr. Goodman. What stereotypes about criminal defense attorneys do you think are most untrue? And also, is it common for people to tell you that what you're doing is wrong morally and ethically?
Well, no, yeah, I mean, to the second point, most people understand why we do what we do. Occasionally, yes, like, we get that question all the time. Can you represent people that you know are guilty? And I mean, yes, I can, because it's not my job, it's the state's job to prove their guilt. And if you understand the importance of criminal law and some of the theories that went behind why we have this adversarial system, you can appreciate that. And most people, once you explain it to them, they can. So it tends to be maybe people with a little less formal education or understanding that don't understand the intricacies of that, because we're generally able to explain it. I don't know, what are the stereotypes? I don't know, like the wrinkled suit and things like that. I try not to do that. Criminal lawyers are very, very ethical too. Like, we have ethical rules that we need to follow, and not everybody does, of course, but you can say that about any area. But I think that's what also helps people understand why what we're doing is important. I don't love it when my colleagues jump in the media and start making some huge statements. Oh, my client is innocent and things like that. You can learn how to deal well with the media while appreciating a case that does have two sides and understanding why society is rightfully very angry with something that somebody may have done. I don't think some representations in the media are that helpful to what we do, but for the most part, there's not really a moral issue. If there is, if you're feeling it, you probably shouldn't take on that client, because once you take on the client, you have to do the best job you possibly can.
Thank you for that.
And if I could jump in a little bit to that, one of the things people interested in criminal law who are coming to law school, and again, when I came to law school in the latter part of the last century, people say, I'm interested in criminal law. Now I find more students come in and say, I'm interested in being a crown and doing prosecution work, or I'm interested in defense work, although there are a lot of people who will do both over the course of their career, but they may have a sense of one thing or the other. And as Adam has pointed out, criminal law is not for everybody. So there are people who say, you know what, this is not something I want to do for moral or emotional reasons, or in fact, if I can't really get into it, I'm not being fair to either myself or my clients. So there's probably a certain kind of set of personal outlooks that and there's certainly very strong moral, political reasons, and I should say social reasons. I mean, the reality is most people who are committing crimes and certainly in Canada are people who are very much socially disadvantaged, Indigenous people and so on. And Adam is also right to point out that TV is entertaining. It's not intended to be providing career counseling and accurate representation of what lawyers do. So how do you represent someone who you know is guilty? Well, although there are certainly cases where the accused comes in and says, I'm guilty, but I want you to represent me anyway. I think they're actually pretty few and far between. Usually the person's coming in and saying, well, I'm not guilty. And, you in your heart of hearts may have some doubt about it, or in your mind of minds, you may think, I'm not sure about this. And in fact, if anything, you say, look, I've got disclosure from the prosecution here. Your story doesn't seem to add up with all the other evidence. And maybe you're going to persuade that person or discuss with that person that they're better off pleading guilty. So it's not all the way that one is portrayed in the media, as Adam says. And I think one of the things, coming back to the question we were talking about, how do you choose what area of practice you want to be in? And I liked how Rishi said, well, sometimes you just sort of eliminate areas. And I think for some people, in fact, I think for most people, they're intuitively thinking about, how would I feel doing that kind of work, and how does it fit with my personality, my intellect, and especially if you do some clinical work in law school, or you spend a summer in an employment place, or for that matter, and increasingly we encourage students, go and meet with, coffee chat. And I think for all you know, my fellow panelists have been great about devoting their time. I find that lawyers are very willing to spend some time with law students and say, you know, this is what I do for my job. Why don't you shadow me for a day and just see what my job is like? And you know, you have to promise that nothing you hear will be everything is confidential and so on, but that you may learn something from that. So that kind of experience, you see, there's certain kind of personality that is attracted to going to court a lot, whether the court is a Zoom court or in person. And there are other people who see themselves doing more work, if you want to call office work, computer work, solicitor's work, and you'll make decisions in part based on your personality. You know, in my experience, there are some kinds of people who really do enjoy criminal law, and they're not, as Adam says, they're not. It's not a stereotypical thing, but there are some people who really seem to enjoy that life, you know, for a variety of reasons, the excitement, the challenge, dealing with people who are, as he says, you know, battling institution and the state is very satisfying. And there are other people who don't like to do that, and they shouldn't. So that's the kind of thing that you can explore. But one of the things I liked about the way when Adam was telling his life story to this point, he was saying, you know, he sort of tried different things and he sort of drifted, and it seemed like a good fit. It seems like a good fit for him right now. And that's why I think, you know, ultimately people have to decide. And if you think, oh, this is a bad fit, and Rishi, I think, points out some way, it's not uncommon for people to, you know, I mentioned big law, to say, oh, nothing could be more prestigious than being working for a big Toronto, New York, Singapore law firm, and that's where I'm going to, you know, end up. But it's actually when they get there and they're well paid and they're working long hours, they say, actually, maybe this isn't such a good fit, and they end up doing something else, and that's fine. I mean, I think that's good to, you know, to ultimately listen to their hearts or their souls or their, you know, spirits and say, this isn't for me. And the good thing is, you have a legal education doesn't mean, oh, so now I guess I'm going to have to go and, you know, work in a fast as a barista. No, there are other things you can do, and with your legal education, just moving around and using the prior experience to go and do something else in law or outside of law.
Thank you for that. All right, the next question from another attendee. This is actually directed to Mr. Rajaya. The question is, how have your experiences been working internationally? Is it difficult advising clients in law in multiple different countries?
Yeah, so just off the bat, I'm only qualified to advise on US law. So I can only advise clients on, you know, specifically New York law. But there are certain, you know, laws in the US. There's the whole federal and state system. So of course, a lot of my work involves advising clients on the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I think the challenge is not so much advising clients about the law. It's more about adapting the law to their needs. And I think that's the challenging part about practice, which is, you know, I think in law school, I think it's changing now, but, you know, some people might have the perception that it's very academic, but that's not true anymore. There's, you know, increasing opportunities for experiential learning, clinics, externships, internships, so on and so forth. But when you go on practice, I think clients who are very business-minded, they don't want you to throw the book at them, right? They don't want you to tell them, okay, section whatever of the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and then you quote verbatim. They're not interested in that. What they want to know is, okay, I have this problem. Tell me what I know. Tell me what you know about like the law, sure, but also tell me how it impacts me. And the way you package that information is very important. And I think when it comes to working internationally, the way people approach business problems and legal problems in Asia, even within Asia, is super, super different from the US, from Canada, from London. And I can't even put a pin on it because every country in Asia is super different. You know, culturally, how they operate in their business environment is completely different. So trying to like be that messenger, I think, is something that I'm learning as well. And I think people learn through practice. But yes, language does help. So of course, when speaking to a client in China, you know, they will love that you speak to them in their own language, as opposed to just speaking English to them and pretending like, oh yeah, I speak English, why don't you adapt to me? Everyone will love the idea that, you know, you are adapting to them. And I think language is the first step there. but also, trying to understand their perspective, what kind of unique environment they're operating in. And when I talk about environment, I'm talking about laws, business and so on and so forth. So yeah, I only advise on US law, and I try and sort of make it palatable and translate it better in more ways than one for the different clients. And yeah, I would say it's pretty challenging, but it's also something I really enjoy, I think, being that messenger. And I think going into law is a good opportunity for people who want to sort of build a bridge, right? And I think all of us, in various areas of practice, you want to be that bridge. And that is really your unique selling point. Your USP is being that bridge. So yeah, it's a challenge, but it's definitely really interesting, and it keeps you on your toes.
There's also one more question from the chat that is directed at Mr. Wang and Professor Bala. Yes, okay. Was there something unexpected or counterintuitive about interdisciplinary research that you learned?
I can start. So I assume interdisciplinary research referring to like just having like I guess a not social science based undergrad. I just want to make sure yeah, I think there's something that's intuitive and there's something that's counterintuitive. So what's intuitive is that like any kind of major project, whatever research project you're talking about in undergrad, teaches a lot of skills just in time management and project management. So in the case of like my research projects, because they tended to be very large, and ecology research projects you have to manage a lot of material, and turns out that plants don't really care if it's the weekend, they just kind of run out of water anyway. So I had like a large team of volunteers working with me, and I had to manage that. And so I could sort of leverage all that when it came to interviews related to law jobs or not. And I think that it was a very good experience. It's a very independent experience too. So I would really recommend it, whether you're going into biology or social sciences. Pursuing projects, whatever it's in, as long as you're passionate about it, you're going to do well in it, and that should be your focus. So pursue your passions. Don't worry so much about like how is this going to look when I want to apply to law school in 4 years. Now the counterintuitive part might be that just realizing that ecology isn't actually that different from economics and finance, because if any of you take any courses in ecology and evolution, a lot of it has to do with efficiency and like but just thinking about the natural outcomes and progressions of things. And so that actually helped a lot in terms of just understanding a lot of financial arrangements, which are like really weird to look at initially, but and they look like they don't really make a lot of sense until you think, okay, well, what is their ultimate goal, and sort of pursuing it step by step. That method of analysis, I think, oddly, my experience studying ecology and evolution was very helpful to helping understand. And I think you'll see a lot of that. I think almost any practicing lawyer or law student, frankly, will say just kind of, I liked this thing in undergrad, so I pursued it, and it got me to wherever I am now. I think very, very few people say, oh, I studied ecology because I noticed that there's a 50% chance that if you're an ecology student applying to law school, you'll get in. Whereas if I was studying social sciences, I would have a 29% chance. People don't really act that way. And what's more is, even if that were true, the disadvantages of studying something that you're only studying to get ahead, chances are you're not going to do as well on that. You're not going to be as motivated or as passionate to pursue projects with that. So definitely, if you're interested in a subject, pursue that. That's kind of the great thing about law school not having course requirements or undergrad course requirements.
Yeah, so as someone who works in a law school and knows a little bit about law school admission processes, I think you've just got great advice. If you are starting university in the middle of university, pursuing your passion and doing well is infinitely more valuable than saying, I wonder what subject I should be taking, and I want to be, pretty candid. Your marks do matter about getting into law school. Other things, your LSAT certainly is important, but most law students in North America, admission to law school is based on their LSAT and their GPA, with more weighting to the GPA than the LSAT, but the LSAT being a non-trivial part of it as well. And there's a sort of good little scientific question. Can you take the kind of courses that some people here, does it improve your LSAT? How much does it improve it? It's a good question. And certainly some preparation for LSAT is really important. Does more help you? Can you really boost someone from 150 to 160 and so on? Pursuing your passions is going to be important and doing well. And certainly law schools look at extracurricular activity, but probably, to be candid, probably less than we should. Some law schools even interview prospective candidates, most of them don't. I thought Rishi made a really interesting, important point that most clients are very practically focused. And in fact, clients go to see lawyers because they have problems, whether it's the bankruptcy of their business, their divorce, their police have arrested them. They're not interested in legal theories. Sometimes legal theory, what we focus on a bit in law school, may be very relevant to their problem, but they want answers, they want advice, they want counsel. And this, going back to AI, yes, an analysis of their legal analysis is often very helpful, but having a broader context in which to understand the problems, and as Rishi mentioned, the cultural context. I would say, in family law, the human context, understanding the process that people and their children are going through in the course of divorce, separation, or adoption, or whatever, is very important. In that sense, interdisciplinarity certainly helps. So, I do quite a lot of research with psychologists, social workers, criminologists, to try to understand law in a broader context, because ultimately law does sit in a broader, it's a human discipline. I think that's what makes it fascinating. That's why people can spend their entire lives in practice of law and say, this is still interesting, this is interesting, I'm learning, and dealing with social, technological, and other kinds of changes. And I see we're just about out of time here. So I think that, to me, this has been a really interesting panel. I've certainly learned from the other panelists. I hope that the attendees have. We're certainly at an interesting and really pivotal time as we move towards the end of the pandemic. As we've discussed here, I'm sure all the technology is going to affect how things are going in the future, but I'm absolutely certain that law will remain for many people an interesting, worthwhile area to study, but there are also many other interesting, worthwhile areas. So, and particularly for our moderators today, it's not something you have to decide now. I'm going to law school. I know I want to go to law school. If you've decided, that's great. But you're entitled to change your mind. I spent all this time in the lab learning about these plants, and it's been so fascinating. I think I'd much rather spend my life down here in the lab or out in the field or whatever with these plants. That's great.
And with that note, I think we can end it off with one last question for each of our panelists, maybe in alphabetical order again. If you could go back in time and go back to your 18-year-old self, I guess just going into undergrad or just going into a law program outside of Canada and the US, what advice would you give to yourself?
Sure. Firstly, if anybody has any questions afterwards, feel free to get my email. Lauren or Amy might have it. I can put it in the chat. Honestly, I'm gonna say stop worrying. I know that's not that easy as a high school or undergraduate student, so I don't want to be an adult talking at you to say stop worrying. But what I will say is that the things that matter to you right now, things like what law school you go to, or what firm you get a job with, once you get into life, nobody cares. Especially with Canadian law schools, they're all good. You're going to get the same core courses that you do everywhere. Like, Queen's might be great for obviously family law or criminal law, and this school might be good for something else. You're going to get the same education. So, but you're going to find in undergrad, everybody gets so obsessed over the rankings and this and that, and nobody ever asks me where I went to law school anymore. And similarly, where you go to undergrad, go where you're going to be happy, where you're going to do well. Nobody asks. And that just continues until you sort of mature a little bit and stop worrying about things like that. And then we find other things to worry about. You don't get less petty, you just find other things. But you know, that stuff just doesn't matter. So just sort of do the best you can, do something that Lucian's advice was great, do something that interests you and go from there.
I think the advice, because I'm going to structure it as advice to all of you, not as, and also kind of to my past self too. Be wary of some of the advice that you might be getting from your classmates right now. Because I distinctly remember when I was in high school, I went to a fairly academically oriented high school, let's say. There was a gifted program. I'll say there was a cyber arts program, and that might indicate what school I went to. But basically, you know, a lot of the people there were pursuing a very academic interests. And so sometimes that can lead to like an echoing effect of bad advice, where there's this, you can feel this kind of community pressure. And I think I actually had someone say to me, and this is going to sound ruder than it is, which is basically like, if you, the form of advice that basically turns on, if you do X, your life is screwed. Just that kind of thing. I know it happens in high school, especially around like university decisions and program decisions and where you want to pursue your career. Look, they don't know any more than you do, to be frank, right? Like, just be aware that like those can be very negative influences, especially when they're coming from peers and such. I know that because it wasn't that far ago. It wasn't that far ago for me, or long ago, far along for me. Like Adam was saying, the closer you get to actually having that, it becomes, the further you are into your career, it starts to matter less and less. And the important thing is that you're pursuing something you're enjoying, right? You don't have to basically be committed to one thing and walking that path forever either. Professor Bala?
No, I think that Lucian and Adam gave such wise advice, and they're so much closer in age to 18 than I am. I'll just pass on this question, but say there was a lot of wisdom there. That, you know, I mean, one of the things that I heard from both of them saying is, you know, to some extent, don't sweat the small stuff. Like, people sometimes tend to focus on things that they think they're planning their long-term futures, but in fact they're just focusing on details that may not be that important. And maybe I've said, to echo a point that Adam made, in Canada, there are certainly, you know, one can say as a ranking of law schools, yes, but there are people who've been to, you know, if we look, for example, and I think here there's a misperception in TV or the media. In the United States, it is probably true that the rankings really do matter. If you look at the Supreme Court of the United States, you know, 7 to 9 judges have been to Harvard or Yale. Like, that's just a reality. And with Columbia and NYU closely behind them. But if you say, you know, in Canada, oh, let's say, and we say, oh, University of Toronto is the best law school in Canada with the best reputation. Say, so they must have, you know, 7 people on the Supreme Court of Canada. Sometimes they have 0, sometimes they have 1, sometimes they have 2, but the rankings in Canada are much less significant. So people are saying, oh, I really got to get into this law school or that law school. It will affect, you know, how you feel. If you like skiing, you're probably going to want to go to Thompson Rivers in Kamloops. You know, there you are, right in the Rockies. If you like sailing, go to Dalhousie. And of course, there are academic differences in terms of the programs. So Adam mentioned, I think we have a very good family law program at Queen's, but there are great family lawyers and great family judges who've been to every single law school in Canada. So it doesn't, you know, if you don't get into Queen's, then you want to practice family law, it's not going to matter that much. So pursue your passions.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm just going to probably echo what everyone else said, which is where you start isn't where you end. You know, you may go to law school, you may not. At the end of the day, once, you know, you start working and you have your whole life ahead of you, no one's going to ask you, you know, in 10 or 20 years, like, oh, where do you go to school, other than to sort of like find a commonality. but it's not going to dictate, how successful your life will be, or whatever, or however you determine what success means to you. So I think that's pretty important. Like when I was in high school, because my parents really wanted me to study medicine, even though my dad was a lawyer, and he said, you're not doing law. So I took like all my IB subjects were mostly like science driven. But, I could have applied to med school, but I still decided to listen to my gut and apply to law school. And I don't regret it. So I think listening to your gut is really important. And, you can never please everyone. So at the end of the day, it's your life. Just make the most of it. Yeah.
A big thank you to our panelists again for answering all our questions and giving us insights into their lives. I'm sure if all the attendees could just drop a happy birthday in the chat for Mr. Wajaya. It's actually his birthday today, and it's also really early in the morning for him. So a big thank you to him as well, as much as all the other panelists today. And thank you again for coming and giving us the insight.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Great to be here. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.